This is an ABC podcast.
What was the scariest part about becoming, a new mum in a pandemic?
The scariest thing. Oh, how deep do we want to go? I don't know. I guess you start even questioning the future and what kind of world you've brought your baby into, in a way. Yeah.
More than a year after the novel coronavirus pushed much of the world into lockdown, a generation of new mothers is still coming to terms with having been pregnant and giving birth in a pandemic.
So that was not something I would recommend. COVID test in labour, no, wouldn't recommend it, definitely not.
To be honest, if I had known that there was going to be a global pandemic, there probably would be no baby.
At one point we're thinking, okay, there's a bit of a flu bug going around, and the next minute we're thinking, oh my gosh, there's people who are going to infect us. Could our baby get sick?
And this isn't over yet. Several cities have recently been back in lockdown, while Sydney still is. And for many who have family overseas, their relatives still haven't met their babies.
So my family and my husband's family are in India, and they were planning to come in August last year.
My husband is German, so unfortunately his family have not met Isaac, my son, and he's going to be 1 in a month's time.
So I'm originally from Brazil, so my family is back in Brazil right now.
And if you consider the uncertainty of the past year, the stress, the isolation, there are lots of reasons to be concerned about the impact that might have had on new mums, as well as babies.
So we know that stress and adversity early in life, including before birth, can have a profound impact on child development.
You're listening to All in the Mind. I'm Sana Kadar. Today, the fallout from becoming a mother in a pandemic.
I guess my mental health was mostly affected by not necessarily worry about COVID, but just the loneliness of it all.
This is Emma, and she had a particularly tough time during pregnancy. She was stuck in lockdown in Melbourne for much of it, but that's only half the story.
I didn't have a partner, but I was living with the father of the baby at the time. He didn't really want anything to do with it. So as well as, everything that was happening with COVID and the pregnancy, I also had to find somewhere else to live, which was another thing that was affected by the lockdowns, not being able to go to house inspections. So I was living with people who weren't necessarily supportive of the pregnancy. I couldn't just go out and see my friends or, stay at a friend's house. Just those few factors just made it, so lonely for me.
Emma was caught in that living situation for 5 long months. By the time she could finally move out, she was 8 months pregnant, and the experience had taken a serious toll on her mental health.
I was really not in a good place during that time. There were a lot of moments where I 100% absolutely regretted my decision to continue with the pregnancy. I was just feeling, a lot of despair, and I had a lot of, I did have a lot of suicidal thoughts coming through, which was just horrible. I'm growing a life inside of me, and in my head, I'm just feeling at such a loss and, just having no control over the situation. It was, I had some really, really dark moments in that period.
Were you able to get any support, or you have, telehealth or, online sessions with your therapist? Or
Yes, I was able to have quite a few sessions, and the hospital did link me in with a social worker and with a psychologist. But at the same time, having those appointments at home where, my bedroom was sharing a wall with the father of my daughter. And often he would be home for these appointments. So being stuck in a house, worrying that my conversation is going to be overheard, it wasn't ideal.
Leading up to her due date, Emma was hoping she'd at least be able to have a baby shower. But in the end, like so many other mums-to-be in the past year, she had to cancel.
Yeah, that was really quite devastating, to be honest, especially not doing the pregnancy with a partner, and so much of it just wasn't what I expected. I held out hopes that I would be able to do a baby shower, but the lockdowns just sort of got stricter and stricter, and quite devastating for me not to be able to celebrate with the people in my life that I wanted to celebrate with.
new parenthood is really this kind of, it's celebrated with a lot of ritual. So, things like a bris or a christening ceremony, these religious ceremonies or baby showers, parties to sort of welcome the new baby, or even just grandparents coming to visit. And so having all of that stripped away, this time that's kind of a time of enhanced need for social support and community, I think was an especially salient thing for new parents to experience.
Dr. Darby Saxby is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Southern California. She researches how becoming parents affects families.
We look at their hormones, we look at their brains, and we follow them across the transition to parenthood.
When COVID hit, her regular research stopped, so she quickly turned to studying how the pandemic was affecting new parents. It's of interest because we know from historical events that stress in pregnancy can have a pretty big impact. Let's detour for a minute and travel back to the Netherlands in the winter of 1944, a period that's been dubbed the Dutch Hunger Winter.
So the Dutch Hunger Winter was one kind of early natural experiment looking at the effects of prenatal adversity on long-term child health, into adulthood. And what happened was the Nazis cut off food supplies to the Netherlands in the winter, I think it was 1944 or maybe early 1945. So really at the tail end of World War II. And it led to starvation, because they just didn't have food coming in. But what was really unique about this was that it was such a fixed period. I think altogether it was, 2-3 months. It was a single season. And so not only does that allow researchers to then look at what is this really specific stress during utero tell us about long-term health, but they were even able to look at trimester-specific effects. And babies that were in utero during what's known as the Dutch Hunger Winter showed changes to their metabolism, to their heart disease risk, to their obesity risk decades later. Of course, this was starvation. It was calorie deprivation. So, it affected things like metabolism more so than, psychosocial stress. But it's still, events like that one sort of helped to launch the field of fetal programming. It's called FOAD, Fetal Origins of Adult Disease, which is just this idea that, prenatal experiences can get under the skin and yield some sort of detectable effects later in life.
Researchers have looked at the impact of prenatal stress from more recent events too, like the 9/11 attacks or natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina in the US.
Some things that have been found are lower birth weight, higher risk of premature birth, higher risk of maternal mental health problems, so anxiety, PTSD, depression in the moms, which then in turn affects their parenting, and then longer term problems with cognitive performance in school. And, with the coronavirus pandemic, you sort of have this natural experiment in the sense that, no ethical researcher would ever create a global pandemic in order to study it. But we can look at how couples are faring, how new parents are doing sort of before and after the pandemic to see whether there are changes that are linked with pandemic-related stress.
But even among the many disastrous, traumatic events across history, Dr. Saxby says the COVID pandemic is unique.
When there's a disaster or a terrorist event, I lived in New York when September 11th happened. People were sort of coming together. Like there was a sense that the city really united. What was so unique about the pandemic is that it forced us apart from each other. So not only was it frightening and it sort of included this threat to life the way that other natural disasters might, but it also forced us to stay alone.
So in that case, what did you look at with your pandemic study and how did you go about it?
Yeah, so we took the questionnaires that we were giving our couples in the lab. So as I said, we'd been studying expectant and new parents over the last 7 years. And we converted those into an online format where we could, blip out the questionnaires all over the world and have people respond from their phones or their computers. And we did our first wave of prenatal data collection in spring 2020. And then we've been following up with the sample every few months. So, we've been following up at 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months postpartum.
And what have you been finding?
We sort of just wrote a manuscript that we've published and submitted to a journal just describing the prenatal data in the first wave. we were really shocked to see the level of distress in the pregnant women that we surveyed. So, in our existing sample of these couples that we'd been following for a long time, they were also, expectant parents. We found pretty typical levels of depression and anxiety symptoms. In these moms who were pregnant during the pandemic, we saw twice as much depression, twice as much anxiety. So in other words, about half of our moms were clinically depressed, which is pretty striking just given that we know that, depression in pregnancy can be risky for mom's ability to take care of herself and her risk for future mood disorders down the road.
There's similar research being done around the world, including here in Australia, with the Australian National University, for example. Some data is starting to trickle out, but mostly these studies are still in the early phases. And while Dr. Saxby's survey was open to people anywhere in the world, most of the respondents were American. And do you have a sense of how many of the women in the survey had to give birth alone?
Yeah, that was something we asked moms to comment on sort of in an open-ended response. And so I don't know off the top of my head what the actual numbers were. I will tell you, we asked moms, do you expect the following changes to your healthcare, like, fewer visits with your provider, telehealth instead of in-person visits, changes to where you're going to deliver, when you're going to deliver, who's going to be with you. And we found that when women said they were expecting changes to the presence of their partner at birth, they were the most distressed women in our sample. And we don't know how many of these women then went on to deliver alone, but we knew that fear of delivering alone was something that really seemed to be affecting these moms' well-being.
Among the mothers I spoke to for this episode, that was definitely one of the biggest fears.
Yeah, that idea would just terrified me.
This is Kimberly. She gave birth to her baby girl last July in Melbourne.
That for me was the thing that scared me the most, to the point where when I called the midwife to ask if I wasn't allowed to have people in, and she said, no. And when she explained, no, you can have somebody in with you in the birthing suite. It's just one person. And I said, oh, good, because if not, I won't come in. And she's like, what? I'm like, I won't come in. I will stay at home. I cannot give birth by myself.
Why did you feel so strongly that way?
I come from I had a bit of a abusive childhood. So I'm very, very scared of being around anyone when I'm vulnerable. So my husband is pretty much the only person I would trust in that situation. And obviously when you're in labour, you're kind of at the mercy of everyone around you. It's not that I didn't trust them. It's just I needed someone there who I knew I could trust.
Yeah.
We're the only species that doesn't deliver alone, right? We deliver babies, traditionally with a midwife or with historically female relatives. But now, that's also a rite of passage for the father to be there to see his newborn baby for the first time often. And so, with the lack of that support, I think that makes birth much more frightening and stressful. We're just not designed to have this experience completely in a solitary way.
Now to some breaking news, and Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews is just stepping up for a media conference.
If we were to fail to take those steps, then it won't be a couple of hundred cases per day. It will be many more than that, and it will quickly spiral well and truly out of control.
As luck would have it, Kimberly went into labour just as stage 3 restrictions were being reintroduced in Melbourne.
There is simply no alternative other than thousands and thousands of cases and the inevitable tragedy that will come from that.
And so what did that mean for your birthing experience? Did that have any effect on?
In the actual birth, it didn't really make too much of a difference, except the fact that I got a high temperature, but because of that, they had to do a COVID test while I was actually in labour. So that was not something I would recommend. COVID test in labour, no, wouldn't recommend it, definitely not. But then after we got to the birthing suite and my husband had to go home, that was hard because he was only allowed in for 2 hours twice a day, which to me didn't really make sense. We managed it, but it was incredibly stressful, and it very much made me feel like you were just an annoyance almost. It was like you couldn't really express how frustrated you were because other stuff was happening somewhere else that was worse. I felt very bad for my husband because he wasn't able to be very involved.
Talking about her experience, even a year on, still brings up a lot of emotions for Kimberly.
Because you just felt so helpless, and you feel so very there's a big push of caring for new parents and all this sort of stuff. And you just kind of felt like all of it was just kind of pulled away and you were left on your own.
Yeah.
And I think it was very much like how I had it as a child growing up in kind of that like emotionally abusive environment. It did really feel like that, where it was like, how are you? Not great. We don't care. Other stuff is going on. Pull it together.
Wow.
And it's just very draining.
You're listening to All in the Mind. I'm Sana Kajar. Today, the stress, worry, isolation, and upheaval of being pregnant and giving birth in the COVID pandemic.
It was when there was a lot of talk about when this hits, the health system could crack under the pressure. And I just remember thinking, am I going to be amongst all of that?
My mental health declined and continued to decline. I think the whole of 2020, it just got worse and worse because it wasn't coffee dates and seeing your girlfriends and having beach days with your baby. It was, you're stuck inside, isolated, not allowed to go anywhere.
I had to go alone to all my appointments. So my husband missed out on things like hearing the heartbeat and updates on the growth.
And I really, really was upset. Like, why did it happen now when we really need our family around us?
Like, it was almost to the point of like, you weren't allowed to be happy about your child being born and being healthy because all this other stuff was going on.
I just really hid away, I guess. I just stayed home in my safe zone.
Ruby, which isn't her real name, went into pregnancy with an existing mental health condition that she'd worked hard to manage over the years. She had OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and you'd think that would make living through a pandemic an absolute nightmare.
Oddly enough, it wasn't as bad as what I expected because in my mind I'd been preparing for this doomsday scenario for quite some time. Always thinking the worst was happening when, it was all in my head, but this time it was for real.
And so why wasn't that so bad given that it was happening for real? Why was that actually okay in the end?
I know it sounds really weird, but I guess it was because like everyone else was taking precautions and taking it seriously, and that normally it's all in my head, but because I had my baby to look after, that also sort of anchored me, sort of gave me like more inspiration to keep trying with all the mindful exercises and CBT and everything else that I'd accumulated over the years.
Things got harder after the birth of her son, though. Ruby's family was meant to be with her in Sydney, but they were trapped in lockdown in Melbourne.
My son was born quite small, so I was quite anxious about getting the feeding going, and as I think most new mums, I was having trouble with like the latching or the attachment. And on I think the third day I had that bluesy episode where I was just really emotional already, and then I couldn't get Lachlan to attach, and they were really busy on the ward, and like I'd been ringing the bell and no one had come for ages, and then finally someone did come, and she just sort of ticked me off the wrong way and the floodgates opened and I was just inconsolable. I was hyperventilating. I was screaming out for my mum. I feel like it was maybe like all the pent-up frustration and like, something had to give, I guess.
The plan had also been for Ruby's parents to stay in Sydney for a few months so they could be around and help with the baby. Instead, her boy was 4 months old before her parents could finally meet him.
Suddenly, like all that support that I thought I was going to get was just gone, and there was no one else around to help. So it's pretty lonely 4 months.
Like with Ruby, the hardest part for Sarah, which isn't her real name either, came after the birth of her second child in April 2020. Remember, this was just after lockdowns had been implemented. No one knew how serious the situation would get here or what impact the virus could have on babies. There were lots of unknowns. But within a week of getting home from hospital, Sarah had visitors who were not exactly welcome dropping by.
We had talked about being proactive and literally putting a note out, like a message out to everyone that might want to visit, and being really clear about what we wanted to do. And we couldn't get the tone right, so we didn't do it. So what that meant was that we did have family come over when the order from the Premier was don't visit anyone. So one time people actually came to the house and I was sitting there and baby had just woken up and it was time for me to feed, and I just didn't know what to do. I was like, they were right there and they were close, and it didn't seem to register for them that it might not be the right thing to do, or that it might be risky, or that it might put us in a weird situation.
Sarah says trying to manage these awkward family dynamics wore her down.
When you were allowed to have limited numbers of people over, we would still keep our bubs with us and not be passing him around for cuddles. And there were people in our family who made it really hard, and I'm sure they weren't trying to make it hard. You know, they were feeling the pressure and the sadness of the times as well. But there was a point where we thought this is actually going to drive a rift between, you know, us and this part of the family, and we just couldn't see how to get through it.
On top of all of that, Sarah was also feeling incredibly isolated in the weeks after giving birth. She'd had a cesarean, which limited her movement.
Because having a cesarean, you're not meant to drive, you're not meant to lift things. I live on acreage, so there's no walking to anything where I live. I have a very active, lovely little toddler who still required lifting. I just didn't know how I was going to be able to do that stuff if I was alone. And so I kind of really began to feel the pressure when my husband had said that he needed to go away for work. He works away a lot. And he had said 4 weeks after, I've got to go. And then I just kind of crashed. When I would think about my husband going and me being alone, it felt like something had a grip on my heart.
And so what impact did all of that have on you? You know, the stress of having people come over, but then also being isolated. What impact did all of that have on you?
I don't know which bits I don't know what the recipe for disaster was, but I ended up with quite bad postnatal anxiety and depression. It just got to this point where every day was quite bleak, and I knew I wasn't myself. Like, just logic went out the window, and the turmoil and the fear that was inside me was not rational, but it was really powerful, and I just had to go and get some help.
One of the places she turned to was the Gidget Foundation. It's a perinatal mental health organisation that supports struggling new parents. And last year, they were absolutely inundated with requests for help.
So the demand for our services went up 122%.
This is Clinical Director Chris Barnes.
So just to give you an idea, I think we'd done about 10,000 consultations towards the beginning of 2020, and then by the end of 2020, the beginning of 2021, we'd done 20,000. So almost double. Yeah, I mean, just phenomenal increase in demand. And I think that's happening across the board in mental health services, not just the perinatal area.
And what were some of the more specific things causing, the most anxiety or stress? Was there any sort of trends you could call out and see in terms of what was affecting mums?
Yeah, I think definitely the isolation was huge. I think they lost a lot of hope as well, and it was just continual anxiety. It's like something would settle, the cases would go down a bit, and there'd be another outbreak. So it was that uncertainty that just, I think, put people in a lot of that fight, flight or freeze response a lot of the time.
And given that huge increase in demand, were you guys able to meet the demand, or were there a lot of women sort of falling by the wayside, not being able to access the help they needed?
Oh, I think that across the board in Australia, mental health services were pushed to the limit last year and continues to be this year. We've actually found there's quite a bit of a lag, in seeking help as well as being able to get access to services. So our existing clients, we were able to meet with them, but of course we have a wait list, and we've always had a wait list at Gidget Foundation, but they've really become, longer.
The vast majority of the Gidget Foundation's clients are mothers, but about 10% are new dads. And while they were struggling too, Chris says she also noticed some really positive changes.
We saw dads being at home more, and we actually saw that, and research has been done, that they actually want to work out how they can keep doing that. So they actually enjoyed a lot of the interaction and the bonding and the connection that they were developing with their children, which was actually really lovely. And the mums would love it because they think, oh, this is actually really what life is like every day. And the guys can actually see what we go through every day, and it's not as easy as some of them might sort of anticipate.
This is actually something a lot of the mothers I spoke to remarked on, that despite the many challenges COVID posed, there were a few silver linings or blessings in disguise along the way.
It was less stress because my hubby was working from home as well.
During COVID, the hospital changed the rules, so you couldn't have any visitors, you couldn't receive any gifts. But as a result, the maternity ward was so quiet. And talking to all the midwives, they said this is a really nice thing, actually. We're noticing all the newborn babies are a lot more calm, the parents are happier.
Yeah, I will say this, that period after getting home from the hospital and before lockdowns eased, it almost was a blessing in disguise because it really just allowed me to get into a good flow and really gain a lot of confidence in myself as a mother and in how it was all going.
In the interest of full disclosure, I should mention here that some of the women you're hearing from in this episode are from my own mother's group. And that's part of the reason I wanted to do this episode. It's because I became a mother last year. Like a lot of these women, pregnancy and lockdown was, overall, a pretty anxious time for me too. I remember when the advice was to wash your groceries when you brought them home. Remember that? I became obsessed with doing that, and I'd worry about touching door handles. I'd worry about going out at all. It really wasn't a fun time. So, given all that we know about the potential effects of prenatal stress, I wanted to ask Dr. Darby Saxby how worried all of us should be who became mothers during the pandemic. Or are there ways to counteract the effects of prenatal stress?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there are a lot of ways to counteract or ameliorate the effects of early stress. I mean, we know that social support and connection are wonderful forms of medicine. And, you know, for kids, one thing that's incredibly important is to have a secure, stable base. Like if you think about attachment theory, the idea that you have this kind of home base that you can return to where you can feel safe. And so, you know, helping children kind of shore up their attachment. We know that kids in general are really resilient. Humans are a really resilient species. We've been through all kinds of terrible things as humans, you know, horrible wars, horrible famines. And so I think the human race is going to continue, but I also think we're maybe going to need to think about what resources we can dedicate to really support kids who've been especially affected by the pandemic.
Looking back at the whole experience now, you know, being pregnant, giving birth in a pandemic, everything you went through, what do you make of the whole thing now?
It was just overwhelming, like the whole thing. I wouldn't, you know, wish it on anybody. I feel for every single family and mother that's gone through this.
This is Emma, the woman who was stuck living with her ex-partner, who wanted nothing to do with her pregnancy. Her baby girl is now 10 months old.
At the end of the day, my daughter is just gorgeous and she's healthy now and we made it through, you know?
Sarah's baby boy is just over a year old now, and after her diagnosis of postnatal anxiety and depression, she got therapy and went on medication.
Like, I don't fall in the hole anymore. I'm not perfect, but I'm back to myself. I can recognise myself again. It's my logical mind that, you know, I like to think dictates most of who I am, although I know, you know, we're humans, so we're not always logical. But certainly relative to where I was all those months ago, things are much better.
The second lockdown here has really done a runner around us because we're just so sick of it. It's exhausting. But I think overall, it definitely confirmed to me that my partner and I are an excellent unit. So we're very lucky with that.
That's Kimberly, who spoke about her fear of giving birth alone. Her little girl just turned 1. And finally, Ruby, who spoke earlier about having obsessive-compulsive disorder. Her little boy is now 11 months old.
I've learnt that I'm stronger than I think I am. I think having a baby during COVID, like any woman, just like deserves a medal. Like, you know, it's a hard enough life experience as it is, but what we had to go through, like, I don't think anyone else will really understand unless they've been through it as well.
That's all in the mind for this week. Thanks to Emma, Sarah, Kimberly, and Ruby for sharing your stories. And you also heard from a number of other women who we didn't get a chance to name in this episode. Big thanks to Cassandra, Nithi, Toby, and Anna as well. Thanks also to Chris Barnes, Clinical Director at the Gidget Foundation, and Dr. Darby Saxby, Associate Professor of Psychology and the founder of the Center for the Changing Family at the University of Southern California. All in the Mind is produced by James Bullen. Our sound engineer is Anne-Marie de Bettencourt. I'm Sana Kadar. Catch you next time.